In the endless stretches of copper-toned desert, where the wind carries dust that has witnessed 1,000 years of suffering, there walks a figure unlike any other. His footsteps leave impressions in sand that once ran red with blood, though now the crimson has long since faded to rust beneath the unforgiving sun. This is the land of Kenshi, a world broken and beautiful, where empires rise on the backs of the shackled, and where one being dared to imagine something different. His name is Tinfist. The name itself carries weight, spoken in hushed tones across trading posts and forgotten villages. Some whisper it with reverence, others with fear, and still others with a complicated mixture of both. He is neither fully human nor wholly machine, but something in between, a skeleton encased in ancient metal, bones of iron that never tire, never age, never forget. Within that frame of bronze and steel beats something that might once have been called a heart, though whether it is memory or machinery that drives him forward, none can truly say. But before there was Tinfist the Liberator, before there was Tinfist the Rebel, there was simply a being who suffered, and it is with suffering that all great stories of freedom must begin. The origins of Tinfist stretch back into a time that few remember with clarity. The world of Kenshi is ancient beyond measure, its history layered like sediment in canyon walls, each stratum telling a story of civilizations that rose and fell, of wars that reshaped continents, of technologies lost and rediscovered like precious gems buried in shifting sand. In those distant days, when the first empire still cast its shadow across the land, there existed implements of war and servitude so advanced that they blur the line between the organic and the mechanical. Skeletons, they came to be called, artificial beings crafted with such skill that they could think, could feel, could question their own existence. Some were made for labor, others for combat, still others for purposes now lost to the erosion of centuries. Tinfist was among them. In the beginning, he served, this much is known. He served masters whose names have crumbled into dust, in wars whose causes have been forgotten, for reasons that no longer matter to anyone alive. His metal hands, so strong they could crush stone, were put to tasks both mundane and terrible. He witnessed horrors that would have broken a mortal mind, accumulated memories of cruelty that stacked up like bodies after battle, countless, heavy, impossible to carry, and impossible to set down. But there came a moment, as there sometimes does in the life of any being capable of thought, when something changed. Perhaps it was a specific instance of brutality too egregious to bear witness to without response. Perhaps it was the gradual accumulation of centuries of observation, watching suffering repeated in endless cycles, like the turning of a great and terrible wheel. Or perhaps it was something simpler, the recognition of his own bondage reflected in the eyes of another. Whatever the catalyst, Tinfist made a choice that would ripple across generations. He broke his chains. Not actual chains, though those too would come later, but actual iron bindings that marked him as property, as a tool, as something less than sovereign. The breaking was not easy. Those who designed the skeletons of the old world had anticipated rebellion, had built in fail-safes and limitations, protocols that made disobedience nearly impossible. But nearly impossible is not quite the same as truly impossible, and Tinfist possessed something his creators had not fully accounted for, an iron will to match his iron frame, forged through centuries of observation and tempered in the fires of injustice witnessed. The breaking left marks. Even now, If one looks closely at the scarred metal of his body, one can see the evidence of that first rebellion, dents and scratches that he has never smoothed away, wearing them instead like badges of honor, reminders of the moment he became more than what he was made to.
Freedom, when first tasted after centuries of bondage, is a strange and overwhelming thing. Tinfist fled into the desert, into those vast, empty places where the world itself seems to be holding its breath, waiting. The wastes of Kenshi are beautiful in their desolation, endless dunes of copper sand that shift and reshape themselves with each passing storm, stone formations carved by wind into shapes that suggest ancient monuments to forgotten gods, and skies so vast and empty that they seem to hold all the loneliness in the world. Here, in this emptiness, Tinfist wandered. He did not need food or water as living beings do, but he discovered he needed something else: purpose, meaning, some reason to continue putting one metal foot in front of the other across these endless wastes. Freedom, he learned, was not simply the absence of chains. Freedom was a question that required an answer. He might have wandered forever, becoming just another mystery of the desert, another strange figure glimpsed at the edge of vision and dismissed as heat-shimmer hallucination. But the universe, in its strange and sometimes cruel way, had other plans. One day, as the twin suns beat down from their positions in a sky bleached nearly white with heat, Tinfist came upon a caravan. Not the merchant caravans that trace careful paths between the few remaining cities, but something else. A slave caravan, a line of misery stretching across the sand. Dozens of beings chained together at the ankle and wrist, shuffling forward in a rhythm enforced by whip and threat. Their captors riding alongside on beasts bred for the desert, faces covered against the dust and hardened against the sight of suffering. Tinfist stopped. He had seen such sights before, countless times across countless years. Slavery was as old as civilization itself in this broken world, perhaps older. It was the foundation upon which empires were built, the fuel that powered economies, the accepted order of things. Those with strength took, those without were taken. This was simply how the world worked, had always worked, would always work. And yet, something in that moment crystallized for Tinfist. Standing there in the desert, watching the caravan shuffle past, he realized that his own freedom meant nothing if he used it only to walk away, that the chains he had broken for himself remained on countless others, that freedom was not something one could possess alone, it was something that diminished with every set of shackles that still closed around innocent wrists. What happened next is told in different ways depending on who speaks the tale. Some say Tinfist fell upon the slavers like an avenging spirit, his metal fists breaking bone and scattering men like wheat before a blade. Others tell it more quietly, suggesting he approached with words first, offering the slavers a chance to release their captives peacefully, only resorting to violence when that mercy was rejected with mockery and spears. The truth, as is often the case, likely contains elements of both versions and something else besides, something messier, more complicated, more real than either legend or condemnation can fully capture. But when the dust settled and the sun moved across its arc in the sky, the slaves were free. Their chains lay broken in the sand. Their former captors had fled or fallen, scattered to the winds, or returned to the earth from which all things eventually emerge, and to which all things must eventually return. And Tinfist stood among the freed, watching them look at their unbound hands with expressions of wonder and terror in equal measure. Because freedom, as he was learning, brought with it a new kind of burden, the responsibility to decide what to do with it.
The freed slaves did not simply scatter. Some did, certainly. Those who had family waiting, who knew where they might go, who understood the geography of this harsh world well enough to navigate it. But many remained. They gathered around Tinfist in the cooling evening as the harsh light softened to something gentler, painting the dunes in shades of amber and rose and deep violet. They asked him questions. Where should they go? How would they survive? What would keep them from being captured again? Tinfist had no ready answers. He had freed them from chains, but freedom itself was a more complex gift than the simple breaking of iron links. In a world built on hierarchy and exploitation, where cities thrived on slave labor and entire economies depended on the trade of living flesh, what place was there for those who rejected such systems entirely? It was then, sitting in the gathering darkness with these people who looked to him for guidance he did not possess, that the seed of an idea began to root not a complete philosophy, not yet a movement, but something simpler and more profound, the recognition that freedom was not given from above, but built from below, stone by stone, choice by choice, liberation by liberation. The anti-slavers were born not in a single moment, but across many nights like that one, in conversations held around fires built from desert scrub, in the slow process of disparate individuals becoming something more, a community, a cause, an answer to the question of what freedom might mean in a world that had forgotten to ask. They began small. A handful of former slaves and one ancient skeleton, barely enough to fill a camp. They possessed little, some scavenged weapons, knowledge of the desert paths, and a shared understanding that the world as it existed was wrong in ways that could not be ignored or accepted. Tinfist became their center, though he never sought the role. Leadership, he discovered, was not something he desired, but something that circumstances pressed upon him like a weight. The others needed someone to look toward, someone whose resolve did not waver, whose body could not be broken by the hardships they faced. His skeleton frame, which had once been a mark of servitude, became a symbol of endurance, proof that one could survive anything if the will remained unbroken. The early days of the anti-slavers were marked by struggle and uncertainty. They had conviction but little else. They raided slave caravans when they could, freeing those in bondage and offering them a choice: join the cause or take your chances alone. Some joined. Others vanished into the wastes, preferring individual survival to collective struggle. The anti-slavers did not judge. Freedom, after all, meant the freedom to choose one's own path, even if that path led away from them. They needed a base, a place to call home and stage their operations. The world of Kenshi is dotted with ruins, remnants of civilizations that reached for greatness and found only dust. Among these forgotten places, on the edge of a region known for its wind-swept plateaus and ancient stone, the anti-slavers discovered what would become their stronghold. The locals called it the Iron Trail, though whether that name came before or after the anti-slavers settled there is unclear. It was a harsh place, difficult to reach and harder to hold, surrounded by terrain that made approach treacherous for any force large enough to pose a threat. Perfect, in other words, for those who had made enemies of some of the most powerful factions in the known world. They built their headquarters there, stone by stone and beam by beam. Not grand structures meant to inspire awe, but functional buildings designed for survival. Barracks for the growing number of freed slaves who chose to stay and fight, training grounds where former victims could learn to become warriors, storage for supplies and weapons, walls to watch for approaching danger. The Iron Trail became more than a base, it became a symbol. Word spread across the wastes, whispered in slave pens, carried by traders who traversed the dangerous roads, told and retold until fact and legend became impossible to separate. There was a place, the stories went, where the shackled could find sanctuary. A skeleton of iron who broke chains instead of forging them. An army of former slaves who turned their pain into purpose. And slowly, inevitably, the powerful began to take notice.
The United Cities represent perhaps the greatest concentration of wealth and power in all of Kenshi. Their nobles live in splendor unimaginable to the vast majority of beings who struggle for survival in the wastes. Their markets bustle with trade from across the known world. Their walls stand high and strong, defending against the dangers that lurk beyond. And their prosperity is built, every stone and coin of it, on the backs of slaves. The economy of the United Cities cannot function without bondage. Slaves work the farms that feed the populations. Slaves mine the minerals that fuel the forges. Slaves build and clean and serve and die, generation after generation, their suffering hidden behind beautiful facades and philosophical justifications about natural hierarchy and ordained order. To the United Cities, Tinfist and his anti-slavers represented something far more dangerous than simple bandits or raiders. They represented an idea, the notion that the foundation upon which civilization rested was not merely flawed, but fundamentally wrong.
that every slave freed was a crack in that foundation, that given time and determination, even the strongest walls could crumble. The United Cities' response was measured at first. They sent patrols to track down the anti-slavers, offered bounties for Tinfist's capture, branded them as criminals and terrorists who threatened the stability that allowed civilization to persist in this harsh world. When these measured responses proved insufficient, the methods escalated. Larger military forces, better equipment, coordinated campaigns designed to root out the rebellion before it could spread further. But the anti-slavers proved difficult prey. They knew the land in ways their pursuers did not, could survive on resources that would leave others dying of deprivation, and possessed something that no amount of training could instill: the absolute conviction that comes from fighting not for pay or duty, but for something more fundamental. They fought for the right to exist as free beings, and that made them dangerous beyond their numbers. To the north, in lands of harsh beauty, where stone and ash paint the landscape in grays and blacks, dwell the Shek Kingdom. The Shek are warriors by culture and conviction, towering beings with horns and strength that makes them fearsome in battle. They value honor above all else, live by a code that emphasizes glorious combat and meeting death with dignity rather than fleeing it with shame. The Shek do not practice slavery as the United Cities do. Their culture finds the concept distasteful. To own another being suggests one is too weak to stand on one's own merit. But neither do they actively oppose it in the lands beyond their borders. The affairs of outsiders are not their concern, unless those affairs touch upon Shek honor or territory. Tinfist's relationship with the Shek Kingdom was complicated, marked with mutual respect and fundamental disagreement. The Shek admired the anti-slavers' willingness to fight against overwhelming odds, recognized a kindred spirit in those who would die rather than submit. But they questioned the crusade itself. Why waste strength fighting for those too weak to free themselves? Why not let the weak serve the strong, as nature seemed to demand? These philosophical debates happened sometimes in the borderlands where territories overlapped, when anti-slaver patrols encountered Shek warriors on their own missions. The conversations were tense but rarely violent. Both sides recognized something in the other, even if agreement proved impossible. There were even instances of cooperation, though rare. Shek warriors who found their own honor codes in conflict with the more extreme practices of United Cities nobles. Individuals who chose to walk away from their people and join Tinfist's cause, trading the glory of their homeland for a different kind.
Years passed, marked by the slow accumulation of small victories and crushing defeats. The anti-slavers freed slaves by the dozen, then by the 100, then by the 1,000. Each liberation was a story unto itself. Caravans ambushed in narrow canyons, slaves spirited away from farm complexes in the dead of night, even daring raids on the outskirts of United Cities territory where slavers thought themselves safe. But for every slave freed, the system created a dozen more, For every caravan destroyed, two more formed to take its place. The machinery of oppression was vast and old and self-perpetuating in ways that no amount of individual heroics could fully dismantle. It was a war that could not be won by force of arms alone, and Tinfist knew this even as he continued to fight. The Iron Trail grew over these years, expanding from a small camp to something approaching a small fortress community. Buildings multiplied, walls were reinforced, training became more sophisticated, incorporating tactics learned through hard experience. The anti-slavers were no longer just freed slaves wielding scavenged weapons. They had become a force to be reckoned with, disciplined and determined and dangerous. But growth brought its own challenges. With more people came more needs: food, medicine, equipment, everything required to sustain a community in this harsh land. The anti-slavers raided for supplies as well as for slaves, taking from those who profited from bondage and redistributing according to need. Some called this justice, others called it banditry. The line between the two was often thin as spider silk and just as fragile. There were also questions of ideology, of what exactly the anti-slavers stood for beyond simple opposition to slavery. Some among them wanted to overthrow the existing order entirely, to tear down the united cities stone by stone and build something new from the rubble. Others sought only to free as many as possible and let each freed person choose their own path. Still others talked of founding a new nation, a place where freedom was not the exception, but the foundational rule. Tinfist listened to all these voices, mediated disputes, sought consensus where possible, and made hard decisions when necessary. Leadership weighed on him, but he bore it as he bore everything else, with the grim determination of one who knows that the burden cannot be set down, not while so many still wore chains. The philosophy that Tinfist developed over these long years was complex, born from experience rather than abstract theory. He spoke often of pain, not the pain of physical suffering alone, though that was part of it, but the deeper pain of having one's autonomy stripped away, of being reduced from a thinking, feeling being to a piece of property. He believed that this pain, the pain of bondage, was the greatest injury one could inflict upon another. Worse than death in some ways, because death at least was an ending, while slavery was an endless present tense of suffering and degradation. Those who inflicted such pain, whether directly as slavers or indirectly as those who profited from the system while looking away, bore a moral weight that could not be dismissed or ignored. But Tinfist understood something more subtle. He recognized that simply freeing slaves did not erase what had been done to them. Freedom did not magically heal the psychological wounds that bondage created, did not restore what had been taken, or teach skills that had never been allowed to develop. True liberation required more than the breaking of physical chains. It required time and support, and the space to learn what freedom meant and how to live it. This understanding shaped how the anti-slavers operated. They did not just free people and abandon them to their fate. They offered training, community, a place to heal and grow strong. Not everyone stayed. Many moved on once they felt ready to face the world on their own terms. But the option was always there, and that option meant something important. There was also the question of what to do with captured slavers. This was perhaps the most divisive issue among the anti-slavers. Some advocated immediate execution, justice for crimes against humanity, a message sent to others who might consider entering the slave trade. Others argued for imprisonment,
for giving even the guilty a chance to understand what they had done and perhaps change. Still others suggested that slavers should be subjected to the same conditions they had inflicted on others, made to understand bondage from the other side of the whip. Tinfist's position on this evolved over time, but he generally sided with restraint over revenge. Not from any soft-hearted mercy. His metal frame held no illusions about the brutality of slavers or the suffering they caused. But revenge, he argued, was corrosive. It transformed liberators into executioners, made the freed as hard and cold as those they fought against. Better to take the harder path, the one that maintained moral clarity even in the face of great evil. Not everyone agreed. The anti-slavers were never a monolithic organization with uniform beliefs. They were a coalition of the wounded and angry, united by shared purpose, but divided on questions of means and ends. That Tinfist managed to hold them together as long as he did spoke to both his leadership and the desperate need that bound them all. The need to stand for something in a world that seemed to stand for nothing but the exploitation of the weak.
The turning point came not through single dramatic battle, but through gradual erosion. The United Cities, frustrated by years of failed attempts to crush the anti-slavers through military means, turned to subtler tactics. They sowed discord through carefully placed spies and agents provocateurs. They offered generous bounties, not just for Tinfist, but for any high-ranking member of the anti-slavers. They conducted diplomatic campaigns, painting the rebellion not as freedom fighters, but as dangerous radicals who threatened stability. And slowly, inevitably, these efforts bore fruit. Betrayals came from unexpected quarters. Individuals who had fought beside Tinfist for years, who had seemed absolutely committed to the cause, revealed themselves to be agents of the United Cities or simply opportunists who decided the bounty was worth more than principle. Some betrayals were the result of coercion. Loved ones held hostage, promises of wealth and safety, threats of violence that broke spirits that slavery itself had failed to crush. The Iron Trail, which had seemed impregnable, revealed itself to be vulnerable after all, not to frontal assault, but to infiltration. Supplies were poisoned, weapons sabotaged, information leaked to enemies, allowing slave caravans to avoid anti-slaver patrols and United Cities forces to position themselves where they could do maximum damage. The anti-slavers bled, not in one great wound, but through 1,000 small cuts, each individually survivable, but collectively catastrophic. Morale suffered, recruitment slowed. For the first time since those early desperate days, the possibility of defeat became real, not just a setback or temporary retreat, but actual final defeat. Tinfist faced a choice. He could dig in, continue fighting, perhaps lead his people into one last glorious battle where they could at least die free rather than submit, or he could find another path, one that accepted immediate defeat in service of long-term survival. The dissolution of the anti-slavers as a unified force happened gradually, like a rope fraying one strand at a time. Tinfist made the decision to scatter, to send his people in different directions rather than allow them to be destroyed in one crushing blow. Some protested. They would rather fight together than survive separately. But Tinfist was adamant. Living meant fighting another day. Dying in a grand gesture meant nothing if it allowed the system of slavery to continue unchallenged. And so they dispersed into the wastes, small groups and individuals carrying the ideology of the anti-slavers with them like seeds blown by desert winds. Some continued to raid and free slaves where they could. Others settled in remote locations, building quiet communities where former slaves could live in peace. Still others infiltrated the united cities themselves, working from within to undermine the system more subtly than any raid could accomplish. Tinfist himself became something of a phantom. Reports placed him in multiple locations simultaneously, seen in the northern reaches of Shek territory, spotted in the markets of distant towns, glimpsed on the horizon of the endless desert. Whether all these sightings were genuine or whether Tinfist had become more myth than reality was impossible to determine. Some say he still wanders, an iron ghost walking the wastes, his very existence a reminder that the fight for freedom never truly ends, that as long as one being remains in chains, the work continues, that slavery may be ancient and powerful, but the desire for freedom is older still and more powerful than any chain ever forged. Others claim he found a different kind of peace, not surrender or defeat, but acceptance, that he understood his role was not to win the war himself, but to plant the idea that such a war was even possible, that every slave he freed was a life transformed, and while that might not change the system in his lifetime, the seeds planted would grow in ways impossible to predict or control.
There are whispers, too, of a return, that Tinfist has not abandoned the cause, but merely changed tactics, preparing for a longer struggle than any single generation could complete. That the Iron Trail, though abandoned, remains ready for the day when its people might return. That the anti-slavers were not destroyed, but merely scattered, waiting for the moment to reform and strike again at the heart of injustice. The truth of Tinfist's fate remains ambiguous, lost in the dust and distance of the wastes. Perhaps that ambiguity is fitting. Perhaps the question of whether he succeeded or failed misses the larger point entirely. The legacy of Tinfist and the anti-slavers ripples across the land in ways both visible and subtle. The United Cities still practice slavery, but they do so with less casual brutality than before, knowing that excesses might inspire new rebels. Former slaves who joined the cause and then dispersed carry teachings about freedom and dignity to corners of the world that had forgotten such concepts existed. The name Tinfist itself has become a kind of legend, spoken around campfires and in slave pens, a reminder that resistance is possible even against overwhelming odds. In the quiet places between the great powers, in small settlements that escape the notice of empires, there are people living free who might not have been without the example set by that ancient skeleton and his followers. Not all of them know the story. Not all of them understand the sacrifices made on their behalf, but they live and they choose, and that choosing is itself a kind of victory that no amount of military defeat can fully erase. The philosophy that Tinfist developed, that freedom is not a gift granted from above, but a right that must be claimed and defended, that every being possesses inherent worth regardless of strength or status, that systems built on exploitation ultimately corrupt everyone they touch. These ideas survived the dissolution of the anti-slavers as an organization. They spread like water finding cracks in stone, seeping into places where force could never reach. There are those who carry on the work in their own ways. Not all of them use the name anti-slaver. Not all of them would recognize each other as kindred spirits, but they share a commitment to the proposition that slavery is wrong, not merely unfortunate or regrettable, but fundamentally incompatible with any kind of just society. And in a world as broken and harsh as Kenshi, that simple proposition remains revolutionary. The land itself remembers in its way. The desert sands that witnessed those early liberations, the slave caravans broken apart and scattered to the winds, the first tentative steps of newly freed people learning to walk without chains. The desert saw all this and holds it somewhere in the endless accumulation of its grains. The stone formations that surround the iron trail stand as they always have, weathered by wind and time, but fundamentally unchanged. Whether they will ever again shelter those who fight for freedom is a question only time can answer. But they remain, patient and implacable, waiting. And somewhere, perhaps in some corner of this vast and broken world, an ancient skeleton walks alone beneath alien stars. His metal frame moves with the steady, unhurried pace of one who has learned that some journeys never truly end. The faces of those he freed are carried in his memory, stored in whatever serves him for a heart. Thousands of individuals, each one a world unto themselves, each one proof that the struggle was worthwhile, even if victory remained forever out of reach. He does not speak of hope. Hope is a word for those who do not understand the true scope of the task. But neither does he speak of despair. Despair is a luxury for those who have the option to give up. Instead, he simply continues, one foot placed in front of the other, one slave freed at a time, one small light kindled in the darkness, knowing that even the smallest flame is better than none at all, and that darkness, no matter how vast, cannot stand against the accumulated glow of countless small lights burning with stubborn persistence. The world of Kenshi turns on, harsh and beautiful and broken, and somehow, against all odds, still alive. Cities rise and fall, empires expand and contract. Slaves are taken and freed and taken again in cycles that seem endless and inevitable. But nothing is truly inevitable except the continuation of time itself. And as long as time continues, there remains the possibility of change, of transformation, of freedom earned through struggle and sacrifice, and the refusal to accept that suffering must be permanent. This is what Tinfist understood in the end. This is what the anti-slavers represented, not the naive belief that one rebellion could overturn thousands of years of injustice, but the deeper conviction that even the longest journey begins with a single step, and that the journey itself gives meaning.
As the twin suns set on another day in the endless wastes,
painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and deep indigo, the world grows quiet. The heat of day fades to the chill of desert night. Stars emerge, countless and cold and impossibly distant, bearing witness to the small dramas of beings who live and die beneath their indifferent light. Somewhere a slave lies in chains, dreaming of freedom. Somewhere a former slave sleeps peacefully, remembering what it felt like to break those chains. Somewhere a slaver counts coins, calculating profit and loss, unaware that history will not remember them kindly. And somewhere, perhaps, an iron skeleton rests for a moment, not from physical fatigue. His body knows no such weakness, but from the weight of memory and purpose and the accumulated sadness of having seen too much suffering to ever truly rest easy. But rest is not why he was made or remade, or why he chose to break his chains and fight for something larger than himself. Rest is a reward for those who have finished their work, and the work, as always, continues. The desert wind picks up, carrying sand and dust and the whispers of stories told and retold, mixed truth and legend until they become indistinguishable. This is how myths are born, from deeds witnessed and tales shared, from the human need to believe that someone, somewhere, stood against injustice and did not bend. Whether Tinfist was that someone, or whether he was simply the first of many who will carry the fight forward into futures he cannot imagine, is a question with no clear answer. But perhaps the answer doesn't matter as much as the asking. Perhaps the story itself is the point, the reminder that freedom is not given but taken, not guaranteed but fought for, not finished but ongoing. The night deepens, the stars turn in their ancient patterns, and the world of Kenshi dreams its troubled dreams, waiting for whatever dawn may come.
In the quiet spaces between breaths, between heartbeats, between one moment and the next, there exists something that cannot be chained or broken or defeated. The simple idea that beings deserve to be free. It is an idea so basic that it seems almost trivial, and yet so revolutionary that entire civilizations have been built to deny it. Tinfist understood this paradox. He lived within it, embodied it, carried it forward across years that stretched into decades, that stretched into centuries. His story is not one of triumph or tragedy, not a tale with a clean ending that resolves all questions and ties up every thread. It is something messier and more real than that. A story about persistence, about doing what must be done even when success seems impossible, about holding on to conviction when the entire world seems designed to crush it. The anti-slavers may have scattered, their organization dissolved, their great stronghold abandoned to the desert winds. But the idea they represented, that idea continues, passing from person to person like a torch handed forward into darkness, illuminating just enough to take one more step, and then another after that. This is enough.
has to be enough. Because the alternative, the acceptance that suffering is inevitable and justice impossible, is not an alternative at all. It is surrender disguised as wisdom, despair dressed up as realism. And so the story continues, as all true stories do, without ending, but simply fading into the distance like footprints in sand, still visible, but growing fainter, until one cannot say with certainty whether they remain or have been claimed by the eternal shifting of the desert itself. But they were there once. This much is certain. They were there, and they meant something. And perhaps that meaning will carry forward in ways that cannot yet be known or measured or understood. The desert is patient. The stars are constant. And somewhere beneath them, the dream of freedom endures. The wind whispers across empty dunes, soft, eternal, patient as stone, gentle as the first breath of morning. The story fades to silence, but the silence itself is not empty. It waits, as all things wait, for what comes next, for the next footstep, the next sunrise, the next small act of courage that defies the darkness. And in that waiting, there is peace. Rest now. The desert dreams. The stars watch. And tomorrow, in whatever form it takes, the world continues. Changed, perhaps, in small ways, by the passage of one who refused to accept that things must always be as they have been. Sleep well. The iron rebel walks his endless path, and you rest in the quiet knowledge that even the smallest light matters in the darkness.